Welcome, everyone, to the PCI Practical Matters podcast, keeping you up to date on government contracts issues. Today, we're doing the third part of Three Areas to Question Traditional Wisdom in Government Contracting. I'm once again joined by Anna Menzel and Tyler Evans. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Anna.
Thank you, John. So today's topic is a continuation in our three-part series. Part two was a discussion of whether subcontractors includes vendors, but today we're going to be talking about data rights. So Tyler and I are at the law firm Steptoe. Tyler's a partner and I'm associate, helping contractors kind of navigate complex issues, including data rights. And so our topic for today is, does the government get rights in data that the contractor has not delivered? So I'm going to discuss a little bit of background, some table setting, and then we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty here. So what are data rights? Data rights are the government's non-exclusive license rights to certain categories of intellectual property. These categories include technical data as well as computer software. So the government receives certain levels of license rights in the data depending on the source of the funding, the nature of the data, whether it was produced in performance of the contract, and whether there are any specifically negotiated terms of the contract. So with regard to funding and non-commercial items, the DoD will generally receive limited or restricted rights in data that has been developed exclusively at private expense, or that is pertaining to an item or process developed exclusively at private expense. The government will generally receive unlimited rights for data that has been developed at government expense, exclusively at government expense. And then a third category of data rights is government purpose rights. And those occur when there is mixed private and government funding. So in addition, the government automatically receives unlimited rights in other types of data, such as data pertaining to an item developed exclusively with government funds, even if the rest of the product was developed at private expense. And also form, fit, and function data is another, typical category of unlimited rights data. And the government's rights are actually based on the type of license it receives. So if the government receives an unlimited rights license, they can more or less use that data for whatever use they want. They can, provide it to third parties. They can use it internally within the government as well. The second category, government purpose rights, allow the government to use that data within the government and with third-party government contractors. So more of a defined use there. And then the last category is limited or restricted rights, and that restricts the government from using the data outside of the government. So the use is solely within the government, or particularly for software, for one machine with restricted rights. So importantly, the government generally only receives contractual rights through non-exclusive licenses, and contractors generally retain the underlying ownership in the intellectual property in the form of a copyright. So what about delivery of data, Tyler?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. And I think that's the second component of kind of table setting for this question, right? We're asking what rights, if any, does the government get in data that has not been delivered? And so kind of implicit in that question is a recognition that there's a difference between data rights, kind of what the government can do with the data that Anna just walked through, and then what is the government's access rights? Essentially, is there a requirement that it be delivered? Can the government demand that the contractor deliver it? Or is it more of a situation where the government's only getting some final summary report and isn't getting kind of the raw data that's generated in performance, which is a common thing that you'll see in government contracting. So that point, the distinction between the two, data rights on the one hand and delivery on the other, is expressly recognized in the FAR. So the Federal Acquisition Regulation, section 35.011, goes into instructions to contracting officers and says, hey, by the way, these rights that we're talking about, Part 27, you're getting those, but there's a separate delivery thing. So you need to think about that in terms of creating data requirements, in terms of ordering clauses, things like that. And I think if you look at the kind of history of data rights, the government used to kind of require all data generated to be delivered, right? They would always kind of what they paid for is what they got, that kind of thing. But in the 90s, they moved away from that. And now you really have kind of a policy by DoD to say, look, we're only supposed to be getting the data rights we need, and the actual data that we need, so the delivery that we need. We're not supposed to demand access and delivery to everything that's kind of generating performance, right? Although you can have that in some circumstances. And so the current situation is you should have in most contracts, for example, you'll see for the Department of Defense, CDRLs, contract data requirements lists items, and those will specify what needs to be delivered in terms of data. You'll see maybe a specific CLIN, a contract line item that specifies what needs to be delivered. Sometimes you'll see it in the statement of work. And then most ambiguously, which is often frustrating if you're a contractor, but good if you're on the government side, the government might include a data ordering clause and essentially say, well, here's what we want up front, but for the next 3 years, hold on to the rest because we might be ordering it and ask you to deliver it then. And so that would be a right to have delivery in addition to the data rights, which again are kind of separate concepts as we walk through this.
So Tyler, what happens when data is generated during performance, but actually not delivered or requested to be delivered? So, an example of this might be a demonstration project or product under an agreement where only a summary test report is actually required to be delivered, but the contractor generated a bunch of data in doing that test. So what happens to that underlying data?
Yeah, I think the answer, the basic, that's the crux of what we're dealing with today. I think the answer is the government still has its rights, right? But that's not something that everybody agrees with, and that's not necessarily generally accepted wisdom, I would say. And we can kind of unpack that a little bit. So the general concept that you'll hear of people that take an opposite position and say, well, no, the government said it was getting rights, but it never asked for the data, so it never essentially perfected those rights. It can't say later that it has rights to something it never received. They all kind of focus on something that you'll see in secondary sources, government resources since the 80s, this concept of something that's inchoate data rights, right? And so what they'll say, they borrow from property principles, and they'll say, well, it's something that's not perfected, right? That's what the government's getting. And so initially, when you saw this term in the 80s and kind of going into the 90s, basically the government, it was being used to describe this concept of delivery, what they already say in the FAR, that look, when you get your rights, it's not really practically perfected. It's inchoate because you don't have delivery as well. So government, you might have government purpose rights in this computer software, but the inchoate kind of concept, if you look back at it, was, but it's not really practically useful to you because you don't have any right to demand access to the software or delivery of it. And so there's no way for you to actually practically use that software. I think what happened was in the 90s, you had people kind of confuse this inchoate concept and apply it to the rights themselves as well and say, well, the government's rights, that first category that Anna walked through, are not perfected until the government asks for delivery from the same contractor in the same contract. And essentially, if it goes through the end of performance, never asks for delivery, and maybe at the end of a 3-year ordering period under a data ordering clause at the end, well, so sad, you missed out on your rights. You essentially waived it. No way to go forward in the future. And the way they often describe this and the sources that talk about this are kind of, if there's a dispute later on, the government can't reference its data rights from this original contract because those were never perfected. They were inchoate, right? And so that's the basic principle that comes along. And I think this kind of concept is, just inconsistent with general principles of intellectual property law. It kind of conflates and confuses property on the one hand versus contractual rights on the other, data rights, things like that. And so when you talk about the government's data rights, as Anna said at the very beginning, it's a non-exclusive license. And across intellectual property law in the United States, a non-exclusive license is not a property right. It's not something that can be taken under the Constitution, takings clause, something like that. It's not something that can be kind of, you have it put up in a court for kind of security, something like that. It's a contractual right. And it's basically at its core a promise not to sue. So me as a contractor, I develop new software. I give a non-exclusive license saying the government has government purpose rights in this software going forward. I am promising that if the government receives that software ever through me or legitimately through another contractor, another contract, or me in another contract, whatever it is, I'm not going to sue the government because I've given them this non-exclusive license. I've given them these government purpose rights. That's distinguishable from a property right. There's nothing that needs to be perfected there. Essentially, if the government ever gets it in the future, regardless of kind of whether it's me or another contractor, the government can then use that data even if it never required delivery in the first instance. And I think that point is recognized kind of in some of the treatises in this area. And there's definitely a debate. People take the opposite position, but I think that position is just not backed up by basic intellectual property law. So with that, that concludes the third topic of our series, and we thank PCI for having us for questioning traditional wisdom in government contracting.
Thank you, everyone, for joining the PCI Practical Matters podcast, and we hope to see you again soon.